Long before names had meaning, before kings carved their titles into stone, and even before the first prayer rose into the sky, there was water. A single ribbon of silver winding through a land of gold and dust, the Nile. By day, it shimmered in the sun like a sacred thread. By night, it whispered to the stars, murmuring softly as if telling stories only the heavens could understand. It did not roar like the sea. It did not rage like storms. It simply moved, steadily and patiently, as it had for countless years. In the beginning, the people did not know its name. They did not know their own. They only knew that where the river flowed, life followed. And so they stayed. They built small huts from mud and straw. They watched the birds circle overhead. They gathered papyrus and listened to the frogs sing under moonlight. They learned the rhythm of the Nile's breath, its rising, its falling, the miracle of its floods. But behind the water was something deeper. A story. A myth. A dream passed from mouth to mouth around ancient fires. The elders would speak of the first time, the Zep Tepi, when the world was born from the endless flood called Nun. It was a time when silence ruled and darkness was everywhere. Then came Ra. He rose not like a man, but like the first light after endless night. From the mound of creation, he called out into the void, shaping the world with his words. He spoke Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture, into being. They, in turn, gave birth to Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. Nut, with her star-speckled body, stretched across the world, cradling it in silence. Ra wept, and from his tears came humans. His eye burned so bright that even shadows bowed. And from the divine soil and tears and laughter of gods, the Nile was born. People believed it flowed from the very veins of the earth, its lifeblood, its gift. Each year, when the rains came far to the south and the river swelled, it brought black silt to the waiting fields. The people called it the inundation. But to them, it wasn't just a flood. It was a promise. A promise that life would return. That the gods still watched. That the earth still remembered. So they danced. They carved offerings into stone. They sang to Hapi, the Nile god, and left flowers by the riverbank. But even as their prayers rose like incense, the people changed. They grew. Villages multiplied. Some grew tall with clay walls and painted roofs. There were boats on the water, sails catching the breeze. There were markets and laughter and quarrels. There were stories painted on pottery, scratched onto rock. The Nile had given them more than food. It had given them direction. And in time, the people began to look to each other, and wonder, who among them would speak for all. Thus began the shaping of Egypt. To the south lay the land we would later call Upper Egypt, where the river was narrow and swift, and the land hugged tightly to the water's edge. Here, warriors and hunters lived close to the flow, following its pulse like a heartbeat. To the north, where the Nile spread into a fan of green fingers, Lower Egypt flourished. The delta was wide, generous, and full of marshes and birds. The people here built open settlements and temples to their own gods. Each land had a ruler. Each wore a different crown. The southern king wore white, tall and pointed, like the tip of a flame. The northern king wore red, curled and coiled like a snail's shell. For many generations, these two lands lived in balance, but apart. The people traded. They married. But they did not unite. Until one day, a man rose from the south. His name, some say, was Narmer. Others whisper it was Menes. Perhaps he was two men remembered as one. Perhaps he was many men shaped into a single name. But what matters is what he did. He dreamed of one Egypt, one river, one voice. With courage, wisdom, and the support of gods and soldiers, he traveled north, not with cruelty, but with purpose. He carried both strength and vision. When the two lands finally met, when the red crown of the north and the white crown of the south came together, Narmer took them both and placed them upon his head. And so, Egypt was born. A land no longer divided. A people no longer unsure. A river with one story flowing through it. He built a city where the two lands touched, Memphis, they called it. It stood on the border, a symbol of balance, watched over by Ptah, god of craftsmen and creation. Here, people learned to write their thoughts into signs, hieroglyphs. They told stories in images, of crocodiles and owls, of eyes that saw the truth, of angst that promised life. They carved into stone. They painted onto tombs. They filled papyrus with names, prayers, and dreams. And the river watched. It watched as power gathered like clouds before a storm. It watched as men began to believe their king was not just ruler, but divine. The Pharaoh, they now said, was the son of Ra, chosen by Ma'at, goddess of order. He held the crook and flail. He wore the cobra on his brow. He stood between earth and sky. He was the link, the bridge, the voice of heaven upon the earth. And as the sun rose each day and set in fire, so too did the people begin to wonder. If our king is divine, what can he build? What monument might reach the gods themselves? And so, quietly, almost like a dream taking form, the idea of something greater began to take shape. A mountain made not by nature, but by men. A tomb not of wood or sand, but of stone. A place where a god might sleep, forever. But that is a story still waiting to rise. Let the river carry you onward. To the age of crowns and pyramids. As the first light of unity spread across the land, Egypt stood blinking into the morning of its great age. The Pharaoh, once a man among men, now walked in the shadow of the gods. He wore the double crown, white for Upper Egypt, red for Lower Egypt, a symbol that his rule stretched from the desert cliffs of the south to the marshy fingers of the delta in the north. But a crown was more than a piece of royal cloth. It was a burden, a beacon, and a bond. For the people, it meant stability and prosperity. For the Pharaoh, it meant responsibility, not just to his subjects, but to the heavens. The Nile continued its patient rhythm. The floods came and went, depositing rich black soil, coaxing wheat and barley from the earth like miracles. And the Pharaoh's duty was clear: uphold Ma'at, the cosmic balance of truth, justice, and order. But how does one prove they serve the gods? How does one show the sky that the earth listens? The answer began to rise in stone. The early kings built mastabas, flat-topped tombs of mud brick, low and humble. But as Egypt grew in wealth and confidence, so too did its ambition. A new kind of tomb was imagined. Not hidden in the earth, but climbing toward the stars. It began with one man, Djoser. Djoser ruled in the Third Dynasty, and his mind burned with curiosity. His chief architect, a man named Imhotep, was no ordinary builder. He was a priest, a physician, and a thinker, perhaps the first genius in recorded history. Together, Djoser and Imhotep dreamed of something never seen before, a monument of stone, layered like steps to heaven. And so, at Saqqara, beneath the desert sun, workers shaped limestone block by block. They stacked 6 mastabas one atop the other, creating the first pyramid. The Step Pyramid. It rose above the land like a stairway for the soul, a beacon for the dead to climb toward the sun. The people were in awe. Never before had stone reached so high. Never before had death looked so eternal. And in this awe, something shifted. If the pharaoh could build such a place, perhaps he truly was divine. If he could rise in death, then surely he had stood among the gods in life. Soon, others followed. Each king sought to outshine the last. Their tombs grew larger, grander, smoother. Then came the age of giants. In the 4th dynasty, on a rocky plateau near Memphis, Pharaoh Khufu ordered the greatest monument the world had ever known. It would be a pyramid, yes, but not stepped, not layered. Smooth as sunlight, sharp as thought. Its base would stretch longer than a field of dreams. Its peak would kiss the heavens. Khufu's pyramid. The Great Pyramid of Giza. No one truly knows how it was built. Theories rise and fall like the Nile's tide. Ramps, pulleys, sledges, each one as wondrous as the structure itself. What is known is this: tens of thousands of workers labored for decades. They quarried stone from far and near. They carved, hauled, lifted, and placed, each block a silent prayer in limestone. Some say it was built by slaves, whipped under the sun. But others now believe the workers were farmers during flood season, fed, housed, and honored for their service. They left behind graffiti, not of misery, but of pride. Friends of Khufu, they called themselves. Drunkards of Menkaure. For them, building the pyramid was not punishment, it was purpose. And when it was done, Khufu's pyramid rose 146 meters into the sky. Its sides aligned with the stars. Its shadow stretched across time. Beside it, his son Khafre built his own pyramid, and the Sphinx. Half lion, half man, the Sphinx gazed east, toward the rising sun, silent and eternal. What did it see? Did it see a kingdom at peace? Did it see the hands that shaped it? Did it dream, in stone, of all that was to come? Perhaps. For the people of Egypt, these monuments were more than tombs. They were promises. That death was not the end. That the pharaoh would rise again with Ra, sailing the sky in a golden boat. That order would be maintained. That Ma'at would be kept. But not all was stone and sunlight. To build such wonders, the state grew strong and strict. Officials spread like the roots of a fig tree. Taxes were collected. Labor was assigned. Grain was counted and stored. Priests held power too. They guarded temples and rituals. They spoke for the gods, and sometimes, they whispered against the king. The balance was delicate. And so, as the pyramids rose, so too did a question. If a pharaoh is truly divine, can he ever fall? Can a god grow old? Can a crown grow too heavy? These questions lingered, silent as the desert wind. But for now, Egypt basked in glory. The sun rose each day over the pyramids. The Nile flowed true. The people worshipped, worked, and whispered. And in that whisper, a new current stirred. Something would shift. The pyramids stood unmoving, casting their long shadows across the sand. The Nile flowed as always, steady and faithful. But beneath the surface, beneath the stillness of stone and river, a quiet unraveling had begun. Egypt, once a kingdom of certainty, now trembled with questions. The pharaohs of old had built mountains. Their names had been etched into eternity. But now, their line had grown thin. One after another, kings ruled for brief and flickering years. Some were children. Some were forgotten before their tombs were sealed. Power slipped through fingers like dry sand. The great court at Memphis was no longer the only voice. In the distant provinces, local rulers, nomarchs, rose with new strength. They held armies, controlled granaries, and built temples in their own names. The unity that Narmer had forged, the divine order that Djoser had claimed, began to fracture. And the Nile, for the first time in memory, changed. The floods grew weaker. The fields turned brittle. The people watched the river with anxious eyes. Had the gods turned away? Had Maat been broken? Famine followed. Villages emptied. Grain stores ran dry. And with hunger came fear. With fear came rebellion. Egypt descended into the first intermediate period, a time of loss, of silence, of competing voices. There were pharaohs, yes, but many. Some ruled from Heracleopolis in the north. Others rose from Thebes in the south. None commanded all. The land was no longer one. But even in the dust of decline, the seeds of renewal stirred. In Thebes, a man named Intef dreamed of more than mere survival. He saw past the hunger and disunity. He saw a new Egypt, not just rebuilt, but reimagined. His descendants, especially one called Mentuhotep II, would take that dream and make it stone. Mentuhotep marched north, not for conquest, but for restoration. He sought to gather the pieces of Egypt's broken mirror and make them whole again. And he did. With quiet strength and sacred resolve, he reunified the land. He took back the red and white crowns. He honored both Memphis and Thebes. He restored temples, grain stores, and faith. And so, the Middle Kingdom began. This was not the glory of pyramid builders. This was something humbler, perhaps wiser. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom ruled not as distant gods, but as shepherds. They traveled the land. They listened to petitions. They watched the Nile not as a throne, but as a lifeline. In this time, literature bloomed. Scribes wrote of justice and loyalty. They composed tales of shipwrecked sailors, of wise peasants who argued with their masters. They wrote of fear, and courage, and dreams. The people read, and for the first time, they saw themselves in their stories. Temples rose again, dedicated to Ammonius, a quiet god who grew in power. At Karnak, near Thebes, a simple shrine began to swell, stone by stone, into what would become one of the greatest temple complexes in history. Trade reopened. Ships sailed to Punt. Gold came from Nubia. Cedar from Lebanon. Lapis lazuli from far-off lands. Egypt was no longer alone. Yet for all its beauty, the Middle Kingdom remained fragile. Pharaohs knew they stood upon shifting ground. They began to prepare more carefully for death, not just with pyramids, but with texts. The coffin texts. Painted inside wooden coffins, these spells guided the dead through the afterlife. They whispered of dangers and promises. Of trials and gates. of Osiris, Lord of the dead, and the weighing of the heart. If a heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured. But if it was light with truth, the soul would live forever. In this age, death was no longer only for kings. Common people, too, sought eternity. The afterlife was opening its doors. And yet, as the Nile whispered once more, the cycle prepared to turn again. In the north, a new threat gathered, not in armor, but in wagons. The Hyksos. Foreigners from Western Asia, they entered quietly at first. Traders, craftsmen, herdsmen. But over time, they settled. Then ruled. They brought horses. They brought chariots. They brought new gods and new ideas. And when Egypt faltered again, they struck. The north fell. The Hyksos established their own dynasty. Native kings fled south. But in Thebes, the fire still burned. Another storm was coming. But not yet. Let us pause here, in the hush before the battle. Let us watch the Nile, still flowing, still dreaming. Because even when Egypt falters, it remembers how to rise. In the northern reaches of Egypt, where the Nile split into many arms and the wind carried whispers from distant deserts, a new sound echoed across the land, the rolling thunder of hooves. The Hyksos had come. They were not conquerors in the beginning. They were migrants, merchants, craftsmen. But as Egypt faltered, they rose. They brought with them new tools, new gods, and most of all, the horse-drawn chariot, a weapon the Egyptians had never known. And with it, they took the north. They ruled from Avaris, near the delta, erecting temples to their foreign deities and carving their names into stone. Yet they did not destroy Egypt. They adopted its language, its customs, even its gods. But still, they were not Egyptians. To the south, in the ancient city of Thebes, the flame of Egypt still flickered. A line of native kings, often called the 17th dynasty, held on with grit and faith. They were no longer masters of the land, but they remembered. They remembered Ma'at. They remembered the double crown. And they remembered the promise of the river. Among them was a man named Sekenenretau. He bore the title of king, though his realm was small. He stood tall against the Hyksos, refusing to bow. But defiance comes at a price. One day, he did not return from battle. When his body was found, it bore the marks of violence, deep wounds, crushing blows. The Hyksos had struck hard. But his blood kindled a fire. His sons, Chamos and then Amos, would carry that fire forward. Chamos, fierce and proud, led daring raids into Hyksos territory. His letters, scratched onto fragile papyrus, speak of strategy, anger, and hope. He pushed the foreign rulers back, inch by inch. And then, after his death, the torch passed to Amos, young, determined, and wise beyond his years. Amos rallied the people. He rebuilt armies. He trained his men not only in Egyptian style, but in the tactics of the enemy. He learned the language of chariots and bronze. And then, he struck. A long campaign unfolded, city by city, year by year. The siege of Avaris was brutal, but Amos did not yield. At last, the Hyksos fell. Egypt was whole again. Amos became the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. With his coronation, the new kingdom dawned, not as a continuation, but as a rebirth. And this Egypt would not merely defend. it would expand. Under Ahmose and his descendants, the army became the heart of the state. Warriors were honored, rewarded with land, titles, and gold. Chariots raced across the deserts. Spears glittered like stars. Thebes, once a refuge, now became a capital of power. Temples multiplied. Most grand of all was Karnak, dedicated to Ammonius Ra, the hidden one who became the king of gods. Each pharaoh added to it halls, obelisks, sacred lakes. Its pillars rose like forests of stone. And the kings of the new kingdom became something more. They were not just shepherds. They were warriors. They were builders. They were gods. One of the greatest was Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt. He marched his armies deep into Canaan and Syria, expanding Egypt's reach farther than ever before. He brought back tribute, knowledge, and awe. He built not just temples, but a reputation. And in his footsteps came a mystery. Hatshepsut. She was not meant to rule as pharaoh. She was a queen, a regent for her young stepson. But Hatshepsut was not content with shadows. She declared herself king. She wore the false beard. She took the throne name Motker. She ruled for over 2 decades. Her reign was one of peace and prosperity. Trade flourished. Her expedition to Punt became legend, bringing back incense trees, gold, and exotic wonders. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved into cliffs across from Thebes, was a poem in stone. She proved that power did not require war. And yet, after her death, something strange occurred. Many of her statues were defaced. Her name chiseled away. Why? Perhaps her stepson Thutmose III sought to erase her legacy. Perhaps Egypt could not bear to remember a woman who had ruled so well. But her temple remained. Her story, half-buried, endured. It reminds us that history is not always written in honor. Sometimes, it is written in fear. Still, the flame of empire burned. Pharaohs like Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, and Amenhotep III continued the legacy. They built. They conquered. They raised obelisks and carved their faces into colossi that stared across time. Amenhotep III called himself the dazzling sun disk. His court sparkled with foreign envoys, gold-plated sandals, and delicate perfumes. But even as the sun shone brightest, shadows began to stir. One prince would see those shadows, and try to cast them out. But that is a tale for another night. The gods were watching. And Egypt was about to change. In the final years of Amenhotep III's reign, Egypt shimmered with wealth and wonder. Obelisks gleamed under the desert sun. Palaces echoed with music and perfume. Foreign kings sent gold and daughters in tribute. The world knew Egypt as a land of gods and splendor. But within the golden halls, one boy watched the sun differently. His name was Amenhotep IV. And his dreams would remake a kingdom. He was slender, thoughtful, and distant. Where his father delighted in luxury, the young prince gazed at the sky. He saw the disk of the sun, not as the eye of Ra or a chariot of Horus, but as a god itself. He called it Aten. A sun that gave life not through priests, but through light. When his father died, Amenhotep IV became pharaoh. At first, he followed tradition. He ruled from Thebes. He honored Ammonius and the gods of the old ways. But something stirred. He began to speak more of Aten. His statues grew strange, showing him with elongated limbs, a soft belly, lips curved in rapture. He changed his name. Amenhotep was no more. He became Akhenaten, servant of the Aten. And he moved the capital. Far from Thebes, between cliffs and river, he founded a new city, Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. Today, we call it Amarna. The city rose swiftly. Broad avenues, white temples open to the sky, no roofs to block the sun. No idols, no dark sanctuaries, only the disk, always shining. The priesthood of Ammonius, powerful and ancient, was cast aside. Temples closed. Statues shattered. Names chiseled out. It was a revolution not of armies, but of belief. Egypt, land of 1,000 gods, now bowed to one. Aten. And Akhenaten? He became high priest, prophet, and king. He sang hymns to the sun. He embraced his queen, Nefertiti, in public, in stone. He showed affection, devotion, humanity, things pharaohs had hidden. Art changed too. No more idealized perfection. Sculptors carved what they saw, wrinkles, slouches, crooked smiles. The royal family was shown playing with children, eating, praying. It was a strange new world. But was it better? Outside Akhetaten, the empire trembled. Vassal states cried for help against invaders. Grain failed. Officials were confused, who to serve? The old gods or the sun alone? Akhenaten remained in his city. He built. He worshipped. He did not fight. And then, he died. The heretic was gone. But what of Egypt? The capital was abandoned. The temples of Aten left to crumble. The priests of Ammonius returned, quiet but determined. A child came to the throne. He was called to Tankhaten, living image of the Aten. But not for long. His name changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. In that small change lived a great decision. Tutankhamun was only a boy, perhaps 9 years old. But behind him stood generals, priests, scribes. The old order was rising. Temples reopened. Statues were rebuilt. Ammonius' name returned to walls, to prayers, to power. Tutankhamun ruled for nearly a decade. He restored faith, if not the empire. He died young. His tomb, small and hurried, lay hidden for centuries. Until a man named Howard Carter opened it in 1922, and the world gasped. Gold shimmered in darkness. The boy king was forgotten no more. And yet, Tutankhamun left no heir. After his death, Egypt wavered. A general named Horemheb took power, restoring discipline and tradition. He had no sons. So he named his successor, a military man named Paramesu. And when Paramesu became king, he took a new name. Ramses. And the sun would rise again. But for now, let us rest in the soft twilight of Akhetaten, where strange dreams once stirred under the open sky. The temples were quiet, but not dead. The great stone pillars, long abandoned during the years of heresy, stood like ancient sentinels, waiting beneath the weight of dust and forgotten incense. Birds nested in the high cornices of Karnak, and bats fluttered through halls once filled with hymns. The silence was not absence, it was anticipation. And then, one night, a child returned. Tutankhaten. He was small, barely 9 summers old, and shy. His eyes held more wonder than command. But he was crowned nonetheless, and with the coronation came a new name. Tutankhamun. The living image of Ammonius. A name of restoration. A name of return. He did not choose it. Others did. The priests of Ammonius, quiet for so long, emerged once more. They whispered into royal ears. They brought back old scrolls. They lit the sacred fires. The heresy was over. Akhenaten city, Akhetaten, was left to crumble in the sun. Its bright, flat temples were abandoned. Its god, Aten, was no longer welcome. In its place, the old gods reigned again. Ammonius, Mut, Khonsu, Osiris, returned from silence. And Ra, whose golden boat rose once more across the sky, carried on the prayers of a people relieved to remember. Tutankhamun, though young, understood the weight of this return. He wore his father's crown, but followed his grandfather's gods. He watched his queen, Enkhsenamun, daughter of Akhenaten, lead processions through restored sanctuaries. She walked barefoot through lotus-strewn courtyards, lifting her arms to idols her family once ignored. Together, they were children of a broken empire. And yet, they tried. They rebuilt statues defaced in the heresy. They repaired temple roofs. Tutankhamun offered gold to Karnak and scrolls to the scribes. He even oversaw the beginnings of his own tomb, not out of vanity, but because he knew he might not live long. His bones were fragile. He limped often. Some say he fell. Others speak of curses, disease, or sorrow. Whatever the truth, he died at 19. And the crown passed on. But the memory remained. He was buried in haste, in a tomb too small for a king. But within it, oh, within it, was treasure so brilliant that even the gods must have blinked. A golden mask. A sleeping face, serene and eternal. A symbol not just of youth or death, but of rebirth. Centuries later, the world would uncover him again. But in his own time, he faded quietly. After his death, an old man took the throne. He had once been a vizier, a scribe, a trusted figure. But now, he was pharaoh. He ruled briefly, marrying the young queen and placing himself at the center of power. His images showed him beneath the Aten and beside the restored gods, a man bridging worlds. He built his own tomb. He offered prayers. And then he, too, vanished into the sands. But the one who followed would not vanish. Horemheb. The general. The reformer. He had served both Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, watching the pendulum swing from one extreme to the next. Now, as pharaoh, he swung it back to center. He was not born royal. But he ruled with royal intent. He erased the names of heretics. He rebuilt courts and codified laws. He restored the priesthood, but on his terms. The temples served Egypt again, but Egypt no longer served any single god. He had no sons. So he passed the crown not to blood, but to worth. Paramesu, another soldier, would become Ramses I. But before we reach him, we pause, because something happened in Horemheb's reign that echoed for generations. He told Egypt to remember. He inscribed decrees calling for the recording of truth, not just glory. He commanded scribes to write not only of gods, but of people. Under him, a farmer's harvest, a worker's strike, a child's offering, these mattered. The divine was not lost in the sky. It lived in every field, in every papyrus sheet, in every statue repaired by calloused hands. A new Egypt was stirring. One that could hold faith and law in the same breath. One where kings wore swords, but bowed to scribes. And in that Egypt, something precious was reborn. Balance. Not just Ma'at, the cosmic order, but emotional balance. A sense that Egypt had learned from its extremes. That the Aten's solitude and Ammonius' indulgence had both taught lessons. That the gods were best honored not with extremes, but with care. And so, Horemheb carved his legacy not in gold, but in governance. When he died, the temples wept. Not for a god, but for a man who had steadied the ark. And somewhere, in a small village near Thebes, a child asked, "Did the king ever speak to the gods?" And her grandfather, a scribe, replied, "No." He listened. And so, Egypt listened too. The wind over Thebes had changed. Not all at once, but like the fading echo of a once proud hymn. The days of glory had not vanished, they had simply grown quieter, veiled behind the sound of temple bells and cautious footsteps. In the chambers of Karnak, where once pharaohs thundered like lions, now whispers danced through the colonnades. Egypt was still beautiful. But she was tired. After the long shadows left by Akhenaten, and the fragile reign of young Tutankhamun, the kingdom craved stability. And so, into the breach stepped generals, not of noble birth, but of ambition forged in the fires of duty. One such man was Horemheb. A soldier. A reformer. A restorer. He did not carve grand temples to himself. He erased the chaos, rebuilt law, and filled the courts once more with scribes and order. The chaos of the Amarna heresy was swept under stone. But he died without a son. His chosen successor? A fellow general, Paramesu, who would reign as Ramses I. His rule was short. But his bloodline would echo for generations. His son, Seti I, was everything a pharaoh was meant to be: strong, noble, faithful to the gods. He built great halls, recarved names, and led armies through deserts. And then, his son was born. Ramses II. Some called him Ramses the Great. He ruled for 67 years. He fathered more than 100 children. He carved his name so deep into stone that later kings simply wrote, "He who lived like Ramses." He fought the Hittites at Kadesh in a battle remembered in scroll and statue. The truth of the battle, victory or stalemate, mattered less than the myth. He had charged alone into enemy lines. Or so the stories said. And in those stories, he lived forever. He built. Oh, how he built! Temples in Luxor and Karnak. Statues taller than 10 men. Columns inscribed with his victories, his prayers, his likeness. But perhaps his greatest legacy was Abu Simbel. Carved into a mountainside, it stood not just as a temple, but as a message. For colossal statues of Ramses guarded its gate, watching the desert with eyes of stone. And inside? A sanctuary so aligned that, twice a year, the sun would pierce its heart and light the face of the god, and Ramses himself. Was it architecture? Or magic? Both, perhaps. Even now, the sun still finds him. But no rain lasts forever. Ramses grew old. His sons grew old. His people began to forget what life without him was like. And when he died, Egypt had changed. His successors tried to hold the line. Merneptah, Seti II, Siptah, Tuzret. Names faded by time, buried beneath the weight of his shadow. In the 20th dynasty, a new Ramses took the throne. And then another. And another. Ramses III would fight the Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders from the north who arrived in waves, crashing against Egypt's shores. He repelled them. But at a cost. His coffers were emptied. Grain grew scarce. Workers at Deir el-Medina staged the first recorded labor strike in history. Yes, even in Egypt, scribes with tired hands and empty bellies laid down their brushes. And then, in the quiet of his palace, Ramses III was murdered, likely by his own wife and son, in a conspiracy as tangled as a serpent's coil. The trial that followed, recorded on papyrus, spoke of poisons, spells, treachery. Egypt had begun to eat itself. The crown still passed from head to head. But with each reign, it grew heavier. Ramses IV. Ramses V, Ramses VI. Their temples were smaller. Their tombs less guarded. Even the Valley of the Kings, once sacred, was plundered. Priests, once servants of the pharaoh, now became his equal. At Karnak, the high priest of Ammonius wielded more wealth than most nobles. Offerings flowed to him. Soldiers answered to him. And in secret halls, statues were anointed not by kings, but by men in leopard skins. A shift had begun. Power no longer lived only in palaces. It breathed in temples. It whispered in chants. A young boy named Nesimon once asked his teacher, "Who rules Egypt, the king or the god?" The teacher looked to the statue of Ammonius, then to the throne on a nearby wall carving, and said, "Whichever one we fear more." In the markets of Thebes, people spoke the names of priests with reverence, and sometimes fear. In Memphis, scribes wrote edicts not from the palace, but the temple. And in the countryside, a mother lit incense not for the king's health, but for the favor of a god she had never seen. The land still bore grain. The Nile still rose and fell. But Egypt was slipping, softly, like sand through a priest's fingers. And even as the Sea Peoples returned, even as Libyan mercenaries settled and became warlords, even as Nubians reclaimed southern borders, Egypt held her breath. Waiting. Not for a king, but for a reckoning. For the gods had grown restless. And so had the people. Soon, the temples would rise higher than the throne. Soon, Egypt would fracture again. But even then, in the golden hush before collapse, the people still believed. Because Egypt had always been more than its kings. It was a song sung by scribes. A prayer offered at dawn. A hope that Ra would rise again. And as long as that sun rose, Egypt lived. The Nile still flowed. Even as pharaohs faded into memory and crowns changed hands without ceremony, the river whispered on. At night, it murmured beneath the stars, ferrying secrets down its long winding course. It passed cracked pillars, broken obelisks, and statues whose faces had been softened by centuries of wind and sand. Egypt was changing. Not with a bang, but with a quiet shiver. The new kingdom had dissolved. Ramses XI, last of the Ramesside kings, had little more than ceremonial authority. After him, no strong line emerged. There were kings, yes, but not like before. In the north, Libyan warlords had settled for generations. Once mercenaries, they had married Egyptian women, spoken the language, worshipped the gods. And now, they claimed the throne. The 21st dynasty began in Tanis. In the south, the high priests of Ammonius grew bold. They no longer served the king, they were the king. At Thebes, the high priest Herihor took royal titles. He wore the blue war crown. He held processions, presided over rituals, and collected taxes. He was pharaoh in all but name. But Egypt was now two lands again. North and south. King and priest. Brother and brother. Sometimes, they were literally family. Marriages were arranged. Priests' daughters wed warlord sons. Letters were exchanged in flowery language. They spoke of offerings, not armies. Power was balanced, not by conquest, but by compromise. And yet, it was fragile. The old borders faded. Nubia to the south asserted its independence. Pirates harassed ports along the Mediterranean. Tomb robbers grew bold. Even the Valley of the Kings was not spared. Yet, through the cracks, light still filtered in. The culture did not die, it shifted. Tombs became simpler. Gold was rare, but charm spells persisted. People wore amulets in the shape of the Eye of Horus. Mothers still told bedtime tales of Osiris's resurrection and the boat of Ra fighting Apophis at midnight. The gods had not left. They had simply become quieter. In every village, the people whispered prayers. They told their children, "If your heart is light, you will cross the lake of fire unharmed." And the children believed. In Karnak, the great temple still stood. Priests lit torches at dusk. They unrolled scrolls and sang hymns passed down for 500 years. They pressed ink into papyrus, copying old prayers so they would not vanish. One scribe named Merenmut wrote, "Though kings forget, the gods do not." And beside him, a young boy asked, "Will they hear me, even if I am not a pharaoh?" The scribe smiled. Yes, especially then. In the north, kings named Osorkon, Taklot, and Shoshenq wore the double crown. They gave their sons high office. They carved cartouches. They even sponsored festivals. But none ruled all. Shoshenq came close. He marched south, took Thebes, and unified Egypt, at least for a time. He appears in the Bible as Shishak, who plundered Jerusalem. But even he could not stop the tide. After him, Egypt splintered again. By the 8th century BCE, there were often 4 or 5 kings ruling at once, each claiming legitimacy, each building their own shrines, each making offerings. It was not chaos. It was a gentle unraveling. And even in unraveling, Egypt created beauty. The music changed, softer lyres, more flutes. The language shifted, less formal, more fluid. On temple walls, the gods looked kinder, more forgiving. In cities like Hermopolis and Mendes, local traditions blossomed. Priests of Thoth collected scrolls and taught astronomy. In Sais, healers spoke of herbs and stars and balance. Faith was local now. But it was still deep. One winter, a storm tore through the Nile Delta. A small temple collapsed. The villagers gathered its bricks and rebuilt it, not with grandeur, but with love. They planted fig trees beside it. And every week, a grandmother lit a lamp there and whispered the names of her ancestors. History did not record her, but the gods heard. In Thebes, a new wave of priests rose, Pinagem, Masaharta, Menkaper. They dressed in leopard skins, spoke ancient verses, and oversaw mummifications. Though they held no armies, they held sway over hearts. When a child died, the priests recited the Book of the Dead. When a young couple married, they called on Hathor. When crops failed, they summoned priests of Shu to plead with the wind. Egypt was not an empire now, but it was a soul. And that soul still sang. In the far south, beyond Aswan, the Cushites watched. They had once been ruled by Egypt. But now, they were strong. They had their own kings, their own pyramids, steep-sided and small, but bold. Their capital, Napata, was full of Egyptian rites, spoken in the old tongue. They had not forgotten. And soon, they would return. But that is a story for another chapter. Tonight, we listen to the hush of the Nile at dusk, to the soft rustle of scrolls in moonlight, to a child asking her grandmother, "Why do the stars move across the sky?" And the grandmother replying, "Because Ra pulls them with his boat of fire, and he never stops rowing." Far beyond Egypt's southern edge, where the sun burned brighter and the sands turned red with iron, there rose a kingdom of stone and spirit. It was called Cush. And its kings remembered. They remembered the temples of Thebes, the gods of Ra and Osiris, the language of the scribes, and the ceremonies of coronation. Though Egypt had forgotten its crown, Cush had kept the memory. And one day, a king of Cush looked north and heard the gods whisper, "Go." His name was Pi. And he believed. He believed Egypt was not dead, merely dreaming. And so Pi rode north, not as a conqueror, but as a son returning to wake his mother. He brought with him horses, prayers, and silence. The silence of purpose. Egypt was fragmented again. Many warlords ruled, petty kings in cities like Hermopolis, Heracleopolis, Memphis. They fought for scraps, built small palaces, and wore faded crowns. They called themselves pharaohs. But they had forgotten how to bow before the gods. Pi did not forget. He moved slowly, deliberately, like the Nile itself. He took one city, then another, not with cruelty, but with ritual. At each conquest, he stopped to offer incense. He bathed in sacred lakes. He praised Ammonius. When he reached Memphis, he wept, not from fear, but from grief. How far the house of Pharaoh has fallen, he wrote in a stela still standing today. And yet, he did not burn. He spared those who bowed. He punished only those who defiled temples. He was not just a king. He was a guardian of memory. And when he reached Thebes, the priests of Ammonius greeted him as chosen. He entered the temple barefoot. He knelt. He was crowned pharaoh. Not by soldiers, but by the past. Pi returned south, content. He did not rule from Memphis. He did not demand gold. He returned to Napata, his capital. Because for him, to restore Egypt was not to own it. It was to heal it. But healing is fragile. After Pi came his sons and grandsons. They too ruled as pharaohs, the 25th dynasty. They built, prayed, and defended. Among them was Taharka. Tall, wise, and resolute. He built temples from Nubia to the Delta. He fought invaders from Libya and the Levant. He dreamed of a united Nile, one God, one king, one people. But to the east rose a storm. The Assyrians. Fierce, ironclad, ruthless. They had conquered Babylon, sacked Israel, crushed Elam. And now, they looked west. To Egypt. The pharaohs of Cush prepared. Taharka rallied armies. He sent gifts to neighboring kings. He rebuilt fortresses. But the Assyrians were relentless. Their king, Esarhaddon, invaded. He took Memphis. Taharka retreated. Then Esarhaddon died. Taharka returned. But the Assyrians came again, this time under Ashurbanipal. They burned Thebes. They desecrated tombs. They carved victory into stone. The Kushite kings were forced south. Their dream of restoring Egypt faded like smoke in a sacred brazier. But they did not vanish. In Nubia, they remained. They continued to build pyramids, more than 200 rise in Meroe alone. They worshipped Ammonius. They spoke Egyptian. They preserved a legacy others let crumble. And in the north, amid ruins, a new order stirred. From the city of Sais in the delta, a family of warriors began to rise. Egypt had been healed by Cush. But now, it would be reborn by strangers. Strangers who wore Greek armor. Who read old scrolls and made new laws. The story was not over. But the sun was setting. The Nile flowed on, uncaring. And in the silence after battle, one question lingered. What is a pharaoh? A man? A god? Or a memory carried by rivers and wind? Tonight, as the stars blink above Meroe and the last embers of Cush glow warm in the sand, the answer sleeps with the kings. And waits. The sands were quiet now. The last pharaohs of Cush had returned to the south. Thebes stood in silence, its temples scorched, its gods watching with patient eyes. But Egypt did not sleep. Not yet. From the delta city of Sais, a new voice rose. Psamtik, wise and practical, gathered allies. He reformed the army, hired Greek mercenaries, and pushed back the last foreign garrisons. The Sate Renaissance had begun. Art flourished once more. Statues of old kings were copied, scrolls recopied with reverence. Even as Egypt had aged, she remembered how to look young. Temples reopened. Prayers echoed again. And for a moment, it seemed the sun had returned. But the world had changed. To the east, Babylon watched. To the north, Lydia stirred. And far beyond, in the highlands of Persia, a storm brewed beneath a golden crown. Still, the Sate pharaohs held firm. Until Cambyses came. The Persian king crossed the Sinai with speed and fury. At Pelusium, Egypt's border fortress, his soldiers tied cats to their shields, knowing Egyptians revered them. The defenders hesitated. Persia entered. Pharaoh Psamtik III was captured. Taken in chains. Achaemenid banners flew over Memphis. And yet, Egypt endured. The Persians became pharaohs. They dressed in Egyptian robes, offered to Egyptian gods, and ruled from Egyptian palaces. The Nile still flowed. Priests still performed rites. But the heartbeat was slower now. Later, rebellion sparked, Inaros and Amartius, names sung in whispers. For a while, Egypt was free again. But only for a while. Then, from the west, came a wind unlike any before. It spoke Greek. His name was Alexander. Alexander the Great, student of Aristotle, dreamer of empires. When he reached Egypt, he was greeted not with spears, but with open gates. To Egyptians, he was a liberator. He visited the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa, deep in the desert. There, legend says, the god confirmed what Alexander believed. "You are son of the god. You are Pharaoh." He smiled. He founded a city, Alexandria. A place of learning, of light, of scrolls and ships. A new capital for a changing world. And then, he died. Young. His empire fractured. But Egypt remembered him. His general, Ptolemy, took Egypt as his own. And thus began the final Egyptian dynasty, Greek in tongue, but Egyptian in soul. The Ptolemies built temples. They mummified sacred animals. They ruled from Alexandria, where the great library rose like a lighthouse of thought. They claimed descent from gods. And last among them, was a queen. Her name was Cleopatra. She spoke Egyptian. She loved Rome. She played the Game of Thrones with Caesar and Antony. And when it ended, she took her crown in her own hands. Rome marched in. The temples quieted. The scrolls faded. The gods grew still. Egypt, as an empire, was no more. But that's not where the story ends. Because Egypt never truly ends. Even as the Caesars ruled, even as Christianity rose, even as minarets pierced the sky, Egypt remained. In the language of farmers. In the dreams of scribes. In the stories whispered to children at night. Temples crumbled. But the stars they aligned to still shine. The Nile still flows, bearing the same moonlight it did when pyramids were young. And sometimes, in the hush before sleep, you can almost hear the chants of Karnak, or the hush of a priest unwrapping a scroll. You can imagine the sunboat of Ra sailing across the sky. You can feel the scales of Ma'at, gently weighing your heart. So now, as you close your eyes, remember. Egypt is not just a place. It is memory. It is mystery. It is a dream carved in stone and carried on the wind. And that dream lives on, in you. Good night, little traveler. May your heart be light. May your journey be smooth. And may the stars above the Nile guide you to gentle dreams.